The desert wind shrieked like a tortured animal, hurling waves of sand against the reinforced glass of the observation bunker. Evelyn, Evie, Carter stood inside, jaw clenched, fists pressed against the cold steel of the console. Beyond the bunker, under the pale light of a dying sun, humanity's last hope was about to be tested. A sleek, silver railgun stood upright on the testing range, its barrel glinting faintly. Around it, engineers bustled in a frenzy, calibrating systems, shouting updates, and triple-checking readouts. The weapon looked like a marvel of modern engineering, but to Evie it felt like a house of cards balanced on a breath. "Are you ready, Earthling?" The voice behind her was cold, mocking. Evie didn't turn. She didn't have to. She could picture Vortin Elax perfectly in her mind, his tall, wiry frame leaning lazily against the wall, arms crossed over his chest, his dark, iridescent skin shimmering faintly under the bunker's fluorescent lights. His eyes, silver discs with no pupils, regarded her with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "Stand by," Evie replied curtly. Vortin chuckled, a low, metallic sound that made her stomach churn. "Your primitive toys amuse me. Show me, then, how you plan to dazzle the Federation with your, what do you call it? Oh yes, ingenuity." Evie's fingers tightened on the console. Behind her, she could feel the weight of his gaze, sharp as a knife. "Fire control, confirm readiness," she barked into the calm. "Readiness confirmed," came the reply, crackling over the static. "Commencing test in 10 seconds, she announced. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. The countdown began, ticking down in the corner of the display. Engineers scrambled off the range, taking cover behind armored barriers. The railgun hummed to life, its coils glowing faintly as power surged through it. 3, 2, 1, fire! A deafening crack split the air as the railgun discharged, sending a tungsten slug hurtling toward the distant target. For a brief moment, hope flared in Evie's chest. Then came the explosion. Not on the target, on the railgun. Sparks erupted from the weapon as its coils overloaded, sending shards of metal flying. The engineers screamed, ducking for cover as the railgun collapsed in a smoking, twisted heap. A plume of black smoke billowed into the sky, a grim exclamation point to the failure. Evie stared at the disaster unfolding on the monitor, her chest tight. Behind her, Vortin burst into laughter. "Primitive trash," he sneered, pushing off the wall and stepping closer. His voice dripped with contempt. "You dare call that a weapon? My species mastered railgun technology centuries ago. This is embarrassing. Get out," Evie snapped, her voice low but laced with venom. "Oh, I intend to," Vortin said, smirking. "But do let me know when you've finished playing with your toys. I could use a good laugh." He sauntered out of the bunker, leaving Evie alone with the acrid smell of failure and the weight of his words pressing down on her. "Damn it!" she hissed, slamming her fist against the console. The comm crackled to life. "Ma'am, the damage." "I don't want to hear it." She cut them off. "Shut it down. Salvage what you can. We'll regroup in an hour." She killed the comm and sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. For months she'd poured everything into this project. Sleepless nights, countless revisions, endless pressure from Earth's desperate leaders. And now, with the Federation watching, it had all gone up in smoke. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden, to her time in the military. She remembered the first time she'd seen an alien weapon in action, a shimmering energy blade slicing effortlessly through steel, faster than her squad could react. She remembered the sound of the blast that had obliterated her commanding officer, leaving nothing but a scorch mark where he'd stood. That memory was why she'd left the battlefield and turned to engineering. She'd sworn to herself that she'd find a way to level the playing field, to give humanity a fighting chance. But now, with Earth teetering on the edge of annihilation, her best efforts had failed. A sharp knock jolted her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Lieutenant Bryce Morales standing in the doorway. His face was streaked with dirt, his uniform singed from the blast, but his dark eyes were steady. "Carter," he said. "You need to see this." She followed him out to the range, her boots crunching against the sand. The engineers had already begun cleaning up the wreckage, but Bryce led her past the twisted railgun to a smaller piece of debris. It was a fragment of one of the alien drones they'd used as a target, a sleek, spherical device encased in shimmering energy shields. The shields had held, of course. Humanity hadn't yet found a way to breach them. But now, as Evie knelt to examine the fragment, something caught her eye. A faint scorch mark. "What is this?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Don't know," Bryce admitted. "We think it's interference from the railgun's magnetic field. It's not much, but—" Evie's mind raced. The shields weren't supposed to show any damage. They were supposed to be impervious. But this? This was a crack in the armor, however small. She stood, her heart pounding. "Get me everything you have on shield frequencies and magnetic disruptions," she ordered. Bryce frowned. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," she said, a spark of determination igniting in her chest, "that maybe our so-called primitive trash isn't as useless as they think." She turned and marched back toward the bunker, her mind already spinning with possibilities. Maybe they didn't need advanced alien tech to win this fight. Maybe the answer wasn't in trying to match the Federation's power but in exploiting their weaknesses. Behind her, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. The wind howled again, but this time, Evie didn't hear it. Her focus was laser-sharp, her resolve unshakable. Vorton could mock them all he wanted. He could laugh at their failures, dismiss their weapons as relics of a bygone era. But he didn't understand humanity. He didn't understand what they were capable of when backed into a corner. Evie did. And she wasn't done yet. The workshop reeked of grease and scorched metal. Evie Carter stood at the center of the chaos, arms crossed, watching her team. It was a ragtag group of engineers, soldiers, and tinkerers, none of them especially remarkable on their own, but together, under pressure, they were the best chance Earth had left. "Okay, listen up!" Evie's voice cut through the clatter of tools and murmured conversations. "We've got 72 hours before the Federation leaves Earth for good. If we don't prove our worth by then, we can kiss our planet goodbye." Lieutenant Bryce Morales leaned against a stack of supply crates, arms folded. "And you're sure about this plan?" "No," Evie admitted, glancing down at the schematic spread across the table. It was a crude sketch of a modified heavy machine gun, hastily drawn with grease pencil. "But I've got a theory, and right now, that's more than anyone else has." Bryce raised an eyebrow. "A theory that involves bullets?" "Yes," Evie said, a spark of defiance in her tone. "Bullets, Bryce. Because their shields are designed to absorb energy-based attacks, plasma, lasers, you name it. But what if we hit them with something physical, something fast enough to slip through before the shield can adapt?" "Sounds like a long shot," muttered one of the engineers, a wiry man named Hal with perpetually oil-stained hands. "It is," Evie shot back. "But it's a shot, and that's more than we had yesterday." Hal shrugged, unconvinced, but he didn't argue. "Here's the deal," Evie continued, gesturing at the schematic. "We're taking an old M2 Browning, yeah, the same one they called a primitive relic, and we're retrofitting it with electromagnetic enhancements. We'll crank up the muzzle velocity to punch through those shields. If my math checks out, we'll have something that can level the playing field." Bryce pushed off the crates and stepped closer. "And if your math doesn't check out?" Evie's eyes met his. "Then we're all dead anyway." The room fell silent. No one wanted to dwell on the stakes. They all knew them too well. "Let's get to work," she said, her voice firm. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Sparks flew as welders modified the machine gun's barrel, stripping it down and reinforcing it for the added stress of the enhancements. Engineers tinkered with the electromagnetic accelerators, arguing over calibrations and configurations. Technicians scoured the facility for parts, improvising solutions when supplies ran thin. Evie moved between the groups, checking progress, solving problems, and keeping morale afloat. She had no time for second-guessing. "Evie!" Hal called from across the room. We've got a problem with the power supply. The capacitors can't handle the load. She jogged over, crouching next to the open panel he was working on. What's the failure rate? 70%, Hal said grimly. If we fire more than a few rounds, it'll blow. Then we need better capacitors, Evie said. We don't have better capacitors, Hal snapped. This is it. Evie stared at the panel, her mind racing. What about rerouting power from the auxiliary grid? Could we stabilize the current that way? Hal hesitated, then nodded slowly. It might work. But we'll have to strip power from the range's sensors and diagnostics. Do it, she said without hesitation. We don't need sensors to aim. Hal grumbled but got to work. By midnight, exhaustion was setting in. Evie leaned against the wall, wiping grease from her hands, when Bryce approached her with 2 mugs of coffee. You look like hell, he said, handing her one. Thanks, she muttered, taking a sip. Seriously, though, Bryce said, his tone softer. How are you holding up? She glanced at him, surprised by the question. I don't have time to think about that. You should, he said. Because if you burn out, this whole thing goes down with you. Evie sighed, letting her head rest against the wall. I can't let it fail, Bryce. I can't let them win. Bryce studied her for a moment, then nodded. Well, if anyone can pull this off, it's you. Just don't forget you've got a team here. You don't have to do it all yourself. She didn't respond, but his words stayed with her as she returned to work. By the second day, the prototype was taking shape. The modified M2 Browning gleamed under the workshop lights, its barrel reinforced with heat-resistant alloys and its firing mechanism connected to a makeshift electromagnetic accelerator. Evie stood back, hands on her hips, as Hal ran a systems check. Everything's operational, he reported. But we won't know if it works until we test it. Then let's test it, she said. The team moved the weapon to an open section of the range. Bryce and a few soldiers set up a shielded alien drone as the target, its shimmering energy barrier glowing faintly in the moonlight. All right, Evie said, taking her place behind the gun. Let's see what this thing can do. She gripped the handles, her heart pounding. If this failed, it wasn't just her career or reputation on the line, it was Earth itself. Firing in 3, 2, 1. The gun roared to life, spitting a hail of tungsten rounds toward the drone. The first few rounds ricocheted harmlessly off the shield, but then... a crack. The shield wavered, flickering like a dying light bulb, and one of the rounds slammed into the drone's body. Sparks erupted, and the drone crumpled to the ground, its shield collapsing entirely. The team erupted in cheers, but Evie didn't join them. She stared at the wreckage, her mind already dissecting what had happened. It worked, Bryce said, clapping her on the shoulder. You did it. No, she said quietly. We did it. He smiled, but the moment was short-lived. Evie's earpiece crackled, and a voice came through. Carter, we've got a visitor. Vortonilax is on his way to the range. Her jaw tightened. Of course he is. Vorton arrived minutes later, his expression as smug as ever. He approached the wreckage of the drone, his silver eyes narrowing as he studied it. Well, he said, turning to Evie, it seems you've managed to scrape together something vaguely competent. Congratulations. Save your congratulations, Evie shot back. We're just getting started. Vorton's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. He didn't say anything as he turned and walked away. As soon as he was gone, Evie turned to her team. We've proven it works, she said. Now we make it better. And with that, the workshop buzzed back to life, determination driving them forward. The clock was ticking, and the real test was still to come. The Federation's warship loomed over the horizon like a dark omen, its massive shadow swallowing the barren desert below. Its sleek, obsidian hull reflected the harsh sunlight, a cruel reminder of the alien power Earth was up against. Evie Carter stood in the open-air command tent, staring through binoculars at the distant behemoth. Her stomach churned, but she kept her face impassive. Around her, The makeshift base buzzed with activity. Soldiers armed with the newly modified M2S adjusted their positions, the barrels of their weapons glinting under the sun. Engineers moved between the squads, distributing last-minute upgrades, enhanced ammunition with tungsten cores and modified accelerators designed to maximize velocity. Lieutenant Bryce Morales approached, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "Scouts report the drones are deploying," he said, his voice tense. "How many?" Evie asked without lowering the binoculars. "Dozens," Bryce replied. "All shielded. The Federation's making it clear this is a test, and a warning." Evie handed him the binoculars, her jaw tightening. "Then we give them a warning of our own." The first drone appeared moments later, its spherical body cutting through the sky like a metallic wasp. Its energy shield shimmered faintly, rippling as it hovered in place. Behind it, more drones emerged, spreading out in an ominous formation. "Positions!" Bryce barked, his voice carrying over the din. Soldiers scrambled into their assigned posts, taking aim. Evie stood at the center of the command tent, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. The stakes weighed heavy on her chest. Failure wasn't an option. Earth's future depended on this moment. The drones moved closer, their shields glowing brighter. A sharp whine cut through the air as one of them opened fire, sending a barrage of plasma bolts streaking toward the base. "Return fire!" Bryce shouted. The M2S roared to life, their modified barrels spitting streams of tungsten rounds. The sound was deafening, a rapid staccato that echoed across the desert. Evie's heart raced as she watched through the monitors. The first few rounds struck the drone's shield, which flared in protest, its ripples growing erratic. Then, with a loud crack, the shield collapsed, and a tungsten round tore through the drone's body. It exploded in a burst of sparks and smoke, falling from the sky like a broken toy. Cheers erupted from the soldiers, but the victory was short-lived. The remaining drones retaliated, unleashing a coordinated assault. Plasma bolts rained down, carving scorched craters into the sand and sending soldiers scrambling for cover. Evie grabbed a headset, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Focus fire! Pick one target at a time, don't spread out." The teams adjusted, concentrating their fire on a second drone. Its shield flickered under the relentless assault before shattering. A barrage of tungsten rounds followed, reducing it to scrap. "Two down," Bryce muttered, crouched behind a sandbag barrier. "Only 30 more to go." "Keep pushing," Evie urged. The battlefield became a blur of motion and noise. Drones weaved through the air, their shields flaring as they absorbed impacts. The soldiers, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with relentless determination. Evie moved between them, shouting encouragement and offering quick instructions. A plasma bolt struck the ground a few feet away, throwing up a spray of sand and knocking her off balance. Bryce grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, brushing herself off. "Get back to your position." He hesitated but obeyed, leaving her to refocus on the battle. By the time the sun dipped low on the horizon, the tide had begun to turn. Nearly half the drones had been destroyed, their shattered remains littering the battlefield. The modified M2S had proven their worth, their rounds punching through shields with surgical precision. But the cost was steep. Several soldiers lay injured, and the base was pockmarked with craters. Evie's throat tightened as she glanced at the casualties, but she pushed the emotion aside. There was no time for grief, not yet. The remaining drones regrouped, forming a tight formation above the base. They hovered in place, their shields glowing ominously, as if preparing for a final, devastating strike. "What are they doing?" Bryce muttered, squinting up at the sky. Evie's blood ran cold. "They're charging for a synchronized attack. If they hit us with that much energy at once, they'll wipe us out," Bryce finished grimly. She grabbed the radio, her voice urgent. "All teams, focus fire on the center drone. Take it down before they can fire." The soldiers adjusted their aim, targeting the lead drone. The M2S roared again, unleashing a hail of tungsten rounds. The drone's shield flared, absorbing the impacts, but it held firm. Evie's heart sank as the whine of charging energy grew louder. "Damn it!" she hissed. "It's not enough!" Bryce grabbed her arm. "Evie, we need to pull back." "No," she said, pulling free. "Not yet." Her mind raced, searching for a solution. Then she spotted a crate of high-explosive rounds sitting near the edge of the command tent. "Bryce, cover me," she said, running toward the crate. "Evie, what are you doing?" he shouted, but he followed, laying down suppressing fire. She grabbed the explosives and ran toward one of the M2s. The soldier manning it looked up in confusion. "Load these," she ordered, shoving the rounds into his hands. "Ma'am, these aren't tested." "Just do it." He hesitated, then obeyed, swapping the tungsten rounds for the explosives. Evie took the gunner's seat, gripping the handles tightly. "This is insane," Bryce muttered, crouching beside her. "Maybe," Evie said, narrowing her eyes at the lead drone. "But it's our only shot." She aimed carefully, her finger hovering over the trigger. The drone's shield shimmered, its charge reaching critical levels. "Come on," she whispered. She fired. The round hurtled through the air, leaving a trail of smoke in its wake. It struck the drone's shield, which flared brilliantly before collapsing entirely. The explosive detonated on impact, tearing the drone apart in a fiery blast. The shockwave rippled through the formation, disrupting the other drones. Their shields faltered, and the soldiers seized the opportunity, unleashing a barrage of fire. One by one, the drones fell, their bodies raining down in pieces. When the last one hit the ground, a stunned silence fell over the battlefield. Evie slumped back, her hands shaking. She looked at Bryce, who gave her a weary grin. "Nice shot," he said. She managed a weak smile. "Thanks." The victory felt surreal as the surviving soldiers regrouped. The battlefield was a mess of debris and smoke, but for the first time in months, there was hope. Vortin-Elax arrived shortly after, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the wreckage. "Well," he said, turning to Evie, "it seems humanity has some fight left in it after all." "We're not just fighting," Evie said, meeting his gaze. "We're winning." For a moment, Vortin said nothing. Then he nodded, a flicker of respect in his alien eyes. "Perhaps you are," he said. As he walked away, Evie felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning, and for the first time, she believed they could win it.